The R9 380. Being critiqued at the start of its release in 2015 for being the last generation's R9 285 with the core clocks bumped up, the R9 380 could have had a bit of a rough start, but at the time of release it was widely approved for its value over its closest competitor from Nvidia, the GTX 960. Having the same MSRP but slightly higher performance, it was almost unanimously recommended over the 960 anytime it came to it. And as much as people didn't like the re-release aspect, it was hard to argue with the performance bump that was provided, if you're buying a new card that is. Upgrading from a 285 was basically pointless. Anyways, its easy defeat of the 960 was over 10 years ago, and the way games run nowadays has changed significantly. I think it's about time we put the 380 back in the ring for a rematch against the enemy it defeated long ago, and see if it can still hold its own. Before we get to that though, we have to go over the actual specifications of this card. The R9 380 released on June 18, 2015 with an MSRP of $200, but I managed to get this card off the local market for $25. Turns out this was quite the steal, as this card on sites like eBay go for around $35 to $50 even for the same 2GB model I have here. The 4GB model is even pricier. It has 1,792 shading units and the just mentioned 2GB of GDDR5 memory on a 256-bit bus. Reference core clock is 970 MHz, but a lot of board partners boosted it slightly. For instance, this one is 990 MHz out the box. Memory clocks remain the same on most models though, at 1375 MHz. TDP was 190 watts, and that power is supplied with two 6-pin connectors. Official driver support ended a while ago, but open source comes to the rescue. The current drivers I'm running are from Radeon ID, version 23.9.3 of Adrenaline. That's one thing that AMD cards will hopefully always have over Nvidia. Open source drivers keep these cards going for so much longer. I mean, just last video I was having troubles with a GTX 780 because of the outdated drivers. The benchmark system is once again the same, my old Intel Core i7-8700 non-K with 32GB of dual-channel DDR4 running at 3000 MHz. And as per usual, I threw a quick and easy overclock on the 380 as well. By running Unigine Heaven and maxing out the power limit slider, I was able to get plus 75 MHz on the core and plus 75 MHz on the memory, although I did have to add 25 mV, otherwise it crashed immediately, and any higher on the core or memory caused a lot of artifacting. That brings the core clocks of this card to 1065 MHz core and 1450 MHz memory. The performance benefit over stock was negligible, but still there. All benchmark numbers for the 380 are taken with this overclock applied, and all of the GTX 960 numbers referenced for the conclusions are taken with its own overclock applied, from my GTX 960 2GB video if you're interested. With the stage set, I reckon it's time to see how the R9 380 is faring in the world of tomorrow. Starting things off, as we always do, we have Forza Horizon 5. Running this game at 1080p on medium, our first frame rates are 38.5 average and 34.8 for our 1% lows. Compared to the almost 50 FPS average of the 960, and we're actually a fair ways behind, and right at the first game. Thankfully, the game was still above 30, so it's playable, but when both of these cards are about $50 used, the 960 is a clear pick for Forza 5. Next is Cyberpunk 2077, a more demanding and recent game. Running the same settings as I did with the 960, 900p native on low, we saw a much closer result, 40.7 average FPS with lows to 34.7. A solid 4 FPS ahead in average and 3 in the lows, giving the win to the 380 this round. Not nearly as concise as last game, but noticeably smoother on the Radeon. It's cool to see games this graphically intensive run on an older card either way. Now for Helldivers 2. The poor 960 wasn't able to run this game at all, so as long as we can get into a mission, we're beating it pretty significantly. And at 720p on low, it actually ran pretty well. Average FPS of 55.9 and 1% lows of 49.1, which is actually a lot better than the Destroyer would have you believe. On the ship, my frames were more like 30, and it was pretty hard to control for some reason. But turns out, on an actual mission, it was very playable. And sure, the effects looked quite blocky, but once I got into it, I didn't notice the lower settings. It was just fun to play. So yeah, 380 beats the 960 in Helldivers 2. Now back to the easier to run games with a classic, Deep Rock Galactic. Running the game on Ultra 1080p DirectX 11, we got 90.2 average with lows to 80.5. Compared to the 101 and 98 of the GTX 960, and we were actually a fair bit behind in this one with the Radeon. Obviously still playable to be clear, in fact very, but the 960 was definitely pushing more frames than the 380. Maybe it'd be a different story with DirectX 12, but I found DirectX 12 and DRG to be a lot less consistent than DX11, a lot of stutters and things like that. That's neither here nor there. The GTX beats the R9 in this round. Doom Eternal is up next, a game I see being notoriously harsh on low VRAM cards, which unfortunately is both the 960 and the 380 in this instance. Well, either way, using the same settings as the GTX 960, 900p native on low, and going through this outside area, we got an average of 82.8 with 60.6 lows. That's a solid bit above the other card. Gotta say, I'm pretty impressed. It's such a shame we have so little VRAM, because holy does the lower resolution and low settings not do this game justice. It, frankly, looks terrible. Although when you start just taking out demons, the low graphic fidelity fades away for the high graphic gore. Anyways, the Radeon takes this round, for sure. Moving along to BeamNG and running the game at normal at 1080p, we got an average of 42.9 with 27.6 lows. Slightly lower average and much lower 1% lows. I have to say, during the run it did feel extremely stuttery. It's possible capping the frame rate at 30 would help it, but when the 960 is pushing 48.7 average and we're going for gold, we had to try beating it by keeping the frame rate uncapped. And unfortunately, we still fell short, giving this game's point to the GTX. On to one of my favorites with Risk of Rain 2, running on the same map as the 960 with the same settings as that video, which are on screen right now. At 1080p with the Artifact of Swarms, we had 132.9 FPS average with 1% lows down to 111.4. Pretty close to the same performance, except the 380 had about 10 FPS higher lows, which is significant. The 6 FPS higher for the average could just be down to run-to-run variance though. But going by the numbers, the R9 takes this game. Not by a sweep, but enough to be noticeable. And as per usual, I will mention, late game you'll see this FPS go down where there's more effects and enemies and whatnots. The Artifact of Swarms helps a bit with the early stages to add more enemies of course, but Risk of Rain 2 gets crazy late game, so keep that in mind. And here we have Counter-Strike 2, where the Radeon has some real competition. The GTX 960 had 214 average and 129 lows, and the last AMD card I ran had some shader caching issues. Either way, running at 1080p with low everything and high dynamic shadows, we got 199.9 average with 126.7 lows. Averages and lows were just a tad lower, but once again, this card had the same stutters on first load. Running the benchmark again, even after closing CS2 and reopening, these hitches were completely gone. Combine that with the fact that I couldn't even get 1440 by 1080 working on this card for a good comparison. The closest I had was 1280 by 1024. And I'm going to give this round in the 960 for, well, just working first try and giving me all the resolution options I needed. And that made sense. And for the final round, we of course have Minecraft. Running with Sodium and Iris and using the low shader preset on our complementary reimagined shaders, we finally got 62.3 on average with 1% lows to 53.5. 4 frames on average higher and 1 higher on the lows, so while it is pretty close, the 960 loses this round. Although it was so close, I doubt anyone would really be able to tell the difference between them, and it could just be because of a different world. But hey, a win is a win. After all the games, it's time to compare the raw synthetic scores with the 3D Mark runs. For the R9 380, we had 10,336 on Firestrike, while the GTX 960 had 8421. I'm gonna be honest, that shocked me quite a bit. There were very few games where the Radeon had that big of a performance gap on the 960, if at all. Sure, there's a game here and there where the frames were definitely higher, but not by the same margins as the benchmark test here would signify. Moving on to TimeSpy, the R9 had a score of 2905, while the GTX had 2513. Once again, the Radeon pulls ahead by a noticeable gap, although not nearly as wide this time. And then we land on Steel Nomad. Neither of these cards really had the VRAM to run this benchmark well enough to give a concise victory, since they both run pretty terribly. But credit where it's due, the R9 got 194 while the GTX got 124, so it did have a higher frame rate. Although I wouldn't play any super intensive game like this on either of them. And that brings us to the conclusion. For $25, I am overall surprised by the performance this R9 380 was providing in every title I threw at it. Most of them above 60, some were more targeting 30, but all of them were playable. Then again, most of the games I run are more oddball and easier to render, so that helps. But this video wasn't just about how good of a deal I got, it was comparing the two budget champions against each other in the modern day. And while the R9 380 had a clear victory back in the day, it seems now they're pretty equally matched. Some games the GTX 960 pulls ahead, and some the Radeon pulls ahead. So if you can find either of them for a good deal, the choice lies more with preference than a clear winner. My final takeaway is, both of them are still viable. They both aged relatively gracefully, and you can't go wrong with either of them.